The morning of September 15th started like any other in the small town of Cedar Ridge, Montana. Population 847, nestled in a valley surrounded by rolling hills where cattle grazed peacefully under the endless sky. The town square bustled with its usual Saturday activity, farmers selling fresh produce, children chasing each other around the old oak tree, and elderly folks gathered on park benches sharing stories and watching the world go by. Nobody could have predicted that this peaceful morning would nearly turn into a tragedy that would be remembered for generations. At the edge of town, the Hendricks Cattle Ranch sprawled across 2,000 acres of prime Montana grassland. For 3 generations, the Hendricks family had raised some of the finest Black Angus cattle in the state. The ranch was a picture of American agricultural success: pristine white fences, red barns that looked like they belonged on a postcard, and pastures so green they seemed to glow in the morning light. But today, their prize bull, a massive 200-pound beast named Wonder, was not his usual docile self. Wonder stood nearly 6 feet at the shoulder, with muscles rippling beneath his coal-black hide that glistened like polished obsidian in the morning sun. His horns, each over 2 feet long, curved menacingly from his massive skull like ancient weapons carved from bone. Under normal circumstances, Wonder was known for his gentle temperament despite his intimidating size. Ranch hands could walk past his pen without fear, and he'd often approach the fence seeking attention like an oversized pet, his massive head lowering for scratches behind his ears. But today was different. Wonder paced his reinforced steel enclosure with an agitation that made veteran ranch hand Miguel Santos nervous. The bull's eyes were wild, rolling white with stress that seemed to come from somewhere deep within his powerful frame. Foam dripped from his mouth as he snorted and pawed the ground with increasing fury, leaving deep gouges in the earth with hooves the size of dinner plates. "Something's got him all worked up," Miguel told ranch owner Tom Hendricks, a weathered man in his 60s who had been around bulls his entire life. Miguel's voice carried the concern of someone who had learned to read animal behavior like others read books. "I've never seen Wonder like this, boss. Not in the 5 years he's been here." Tom studied the massive animal with growing concern, his experienced eyes taking in every detail of Wonder's distressed behavior. The bull had been agitated since before dawn, refusing his morning feed and water. His distress seemed to be escalating by the hour, and Tom's instincts, honed by decades of working with livestock, were screaming warnings. "Maybe it's the storm coming in," Tom suggested, noting the dark clouds gathering on the horizon like an approaching army. The air carried that electric charge that comes before severe weather, and the barometric pressure had been dropping all morning. "Animals can sense weather changes before we do. Remember how the horses acted before that tornado 3 years back?" But Miguel wasn't convinced. He'd worked with cattle for 30 years, starting as a teenager on his father's ranch in Texas, before coming north to Montana. Something about Wonder's behavior triggered every alarm bell in his experienced mind. This wasn't weather anxiety. This was something deeper, more primal. The bull's movements were too erratic, too focused, as if he were responding to some invisible threat that only he could perceive. "Should we call Doc Peterson?" Miguel asked, referring to the local veterinarian. "Maybe Wonder's got something medical going on." Tom considered this, watching as Wonder charged at the fence post nearest to them, his massive shoulder slamming into the steel with a clang that echoed across the ranch. The impact was so powerful, it bent the reinforced post, and Wonder backed up to charge again. "Let's give it another hour," Tom decided. "If he doesn't calm down, we'll get Doc out here." It was a decision he would regret for the rest of his life. At 10:30 a.m., during the busiest part of the Saturday morning market, disaster struck with the sudden violence of a lightning bolt. A delivery truck making its rounds to the local grocery store backfired near the ranch gate, the engine producing a sound like a gunshot that cracked across the valley like a whip. The sharp explosion was exactly the trigger Wonder's overwrought nervous system couldn't handle. With a bellow that could be heard 3 miles away, a sound that residents later described as something between a freight train and a war cry, the massive bull charged straight through his reinforced steel gate. The metal screamed in protest as it bent and twisted under his incredible force, the welds snapping like twigs as 2,000 pounds of enraged muscle and fury burst through the barrier that had contained him for 5 years. Tom Hendricks watched in absolute horror as his prize bull, worth more than most people's houses, broke free and headed straight toward town. Wonder's hooves thundered against the ground like war drums, each step covering 8 feet as he gathered speed. Dust clouds billowed behind him like smoke from a wildfire, and his bellowing roars continued to split the morning air. "Call the sheriff!" Tom shouted to Miguel, even as he grabbed his truck keys with hands that suddenly trembled. "And call the emergency services! That bull's headed straight for the town square!" Miguel was already running toward the ranch house, his cell phone pressed to his ear as he tried to explain the impossible situation to the 911 dispatcher. "You need to evacuate the town square," he shouted into the phone. "We've got a 2,000-pound bull heading straight for the Saturday market." In Cedar Ridge's town square, the Saturday market was in full swing, a scene of Americana that could have been lifted from a Norman Rockwell painting. Martha Williams had just finished arranging her prize-winning roses at her flower stand, their red and pink petals catching the morning light like scattered jewels. Children ran between the stalls with ice cream cones and cotton candy, their laughter mixing with the conversations of adults haggling over fresh vegetables and handmade crafts. Mrs. Peterson was putting the finishing touches on her quilt display, proud of the intricate patterns that had taken her months to complete. The local high school band was setting up for their noon performance, teenagers in crisp uniforms tuning instruments and joking with each other about the upcoming homecoming dance. It was into this picture of perfect small-town tranquility that Wonder was charging like an avalanche of fury and destruction. Martha Williams was the first to hear it, the rhythmic pounding of hooves getting closer and closer, growing louder with each passing second. "Oh my God," she whispered, looking down Main Street toward the approaching dust cloud that seemed to be moving with unnatural speed. "Is that a—" Her question was answered as Wonder burst into view, his massive form blocking out the sun as he charged directly toward the crowded square. The chaos in Cedar Ridge's town square was absolute and terrifying. Wonder, the massive 2,200-pound bull, continued his destructive rampage through the Saturday market, his fury seeming to intensify with each passing moment. The peaceful morning had transformed into a scene from a nightmare as vendors' stalls lay in ruins, their contents scattered across the dusty ground like the aftermath of a tornado. His eyes blazed with uncontainable fury, rolling white with a madness that seemed to consume his very soul. Bellowing roars echoed off the buildings like thunder, each sound sending fresh waves of panic through the fleeing crowd. Wonder's massive horns swept left and right with devastating precision, catching anything in his path and sending it flying through the air like toys thrown by an angry child. Sheriff Davidson had positioned his patrol car as a makeshift barrier, hoping to redirect Wonder's path away from the fleeing civilians. The veteran lawman, who had served Cedar Ridge for 15 years and thought he'd seen everything, found himself facing a situation that defied all his training and experience. But the enraged bull paid no attention to the vehicle, his wild eyes focused only on destruction. "Stay back!" Sheriff Davidson shouted into his radio, his voice cracking with the strain of trying to coordinate an impossible situation. "Do not approach the animal. I repeat, do not approach. We need animal control and tranquilizer equipment immediately." The emergency response was chaotic at best. Cedar Ridge wasn't equipped for this kind of crisis. Their small volunteer fire department had protocols for house fires and car accidents, not rampaging bulls. The nearest animal control officer was 2 counties away, and the state police were at least an hour out. Wonder's rampage continued with methodical destruction. Mrs. Peterson's craft booth exploded in a shower of wooden splinters and colorful fabric as his massive horns caught the structure. Handmade quilts that had taken months to create flew through the air like confetti. A fruit stand disappeared in seconds, apples and oranges bouncing across the pavement as the vendor scrambled for safety behind a parked car. But Sheriff Davidson's warnings fell on deaf ears. Literally. 12-year-old Lily Morrison couldn't hear the sheriff's commands over the radio, and even if she could, something deeper was calling her forward with an irresistible pull that defied all logic and reason. Lily moved through the chaos with an eerie calm that defied explanation. While seasoned adults cowered behind buildings and inside shops, their hearts pounding with terror, this blind child walked steadily toward the source of all the destruction. Her white cane tapped rhythmically against the pavement, a gentle sound almost lost in the cacophony of Wonder's rampage. "Lily!" Her grandmother Rose called desperately from the cabin porch, her voice hoarse with fear and desperation. "Please come back. It's not safe." Rose Morrison was 73 years old and had been caring for Lily since the girl's parents died in a car accident on a snowy December night 3 years earlier. She'd watched her granddaughter develop an almost supernatural connection with animals during that time. Stray cats would follow Lily home, injured birds would land on her windowsill as if seeking her help, and even the most aggressive dogs in the neighborhood would become gentle in her presence. But this was beyond anything Rose had ever witnessed. This wasn't a hurt sparrow or a lonely kitten. This was a bull that could kill her precious granddaughter with a single movement. Lily paused in the middle of the square, her head tilted at that distinctive angle that meant she was processing something through her enhanced senses. Her blindness had sharpened her other abilities to an almost preternatural degree. She could hear things others missed, feel vibrations in the ground that spoke to her like a language only she understood. While everyone else heard only chaos and destruction, the screaming of terrified people, the crash of splintering wood, the thundering of massive hooves against pavement, Lily seemed to be listening to something entirely different. Her expression was peaceful, almost serene, as if she were standing in a quiet meadow instead of the center of a disaster. Wonder had just demolished the last remaining fruit stand when he caught sight of the small figure standing motionless in his path. The bull's massive head lowered, his nostrils flaring as steam rose from his overheated body. Foam continued to drip from his mouth, and his eyes rolled with uncontained fury that had been building for hours. This was the moment everyone watching would remember for the rest of their lives, the moment that would be talked about in Cedar Ridge for generations to come. Instead of fleeing like every survival instinct should have commanded, Lily took a step forward, then another. Her movements were deliberate and calm, as if she were simply walking to school on any ordinary day. Her white dress, chosen by her grandmother that morning for its cheerful yellow flowers, fluttered gently in the breeze. "Someone stop her!" Martha Williams screamed from inside the flower shop where she'd taken refuge. "That bull will kill her! She can't see what she's walking into!" But Tom Hendricks, who had arrived just in time to witness this impossible scene, shouted back through his truck window, "Nobody move! Any sudden movement might trigger him to charge." Dr. Sarah Chen, Cedar Ridge's only veterinarian, had arrived expecting to tranquilize a dangerous animal. She'd brought her largest tranquilizer gun and enough sedative to drop a horse, but the scene before her defied everything she'd learned in veterinary school. Instead of a rampaging beast that needed to be subdued, she was watching something that bordered on the miraculous. Wonder stood completely still as Lily came within 20 feet of his massive form. The bull's breathing was still labored from his rampage, his sides heaving like bellows, but the wild rolling of his eyes had stopped. Instead, he seemed to be studying the small girl who showed no fear of his intimidating presence. The transformation was so subtle that most witnesses didn't notice it at first. Wonder's ears, which had been pinned back against his skull in rage, slowly moved forward. His massive head, lowered for charging, began to rise. The foam around his mouth seemed to lessen, and his breathing, while still heavy, took on a more regular rhythm. Lily stopped just 10 feet from Wonder's massive head. She was so small compared to the bull that she barely reached his shoulder, yet there was something in her posture, straight-backed, confident, unafraid, that commanded respect. Her white cane rested gently in her left hand, while her right arm hung relaxed at her side. For a moment that felt like eternity, girl and bull regarded each other across a distance that represented the space between chaos and calm, between fear and understanding, between the world as it was and the world as it could be. Then Lily did something that made every witness question their own sanity and their understanding of what was possible. She extended her right hand toward Wonder, palm up, in the universal gesture of peaceful offering. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was so soft that only Wonder could hear the words that would change everything. This incredible story is touching hearts around the world. If you're amazed by what you've seen so far, please hit that like button. It really helps us share these inspiring stories with more people who need to see them. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel because we have so many more unbelievable true stories coming your way that will restore your faith in the power of human connection. But whatever 12-year-old Lily Morrison whispered to that furious bull in those crucial seconds changed everything that anyone in Cedar Ridge thought they knew about the impossible. Wonder's massive head lowered until his muzzle was inches from Lily's outstretched hand. The transformation was so complete and sudden that several witnesses later swore they'd imagined the entire rampage. The bull's breathing slowed from the labored panting of rage to something approaching normal. His muscles, which had been coiled like steel springs ready to explode into violence, began to relax with each passing second. The wild fury that had consumed him for the past hour simply disappeared. Lily's small hand made contact with Wonder's nose, and the massive bull closed his eyes like a contented pet receiving affection from a beloved owner. His great head pressed gently against her palm, and for the first time since dawn, Wonder stood completely still. The silence that followed was broken only by the distant wail of emergency sirens and the sound of people slowly, cautiously emerging from their hiding places. It was the kind of silence that follows a miracle, heavy with disbelief and wonder. How did she... Sheriff Davidson's voice trailed off as he climbed out of his patrol car, his hand still resting on his service weapon, but no longer seeing any threat to neutralize. In 15 years of law enforcement, he'd witnessed domestic disputes, bar fights, car accidents, and even a bank robbery. But nothing had prepared him for what he'd just seen. Dr. Sarah Chen approached slowly, her tranquilizer gun hanging uselessly at her side. She'd graduated top of her class from Colorado State University's veterinary program, completed a residency in large animal medicine, and spent 8 years treating everything from prize-winning racehorses to ornery bulls. Her scientific mind struggled to process what she was witnessing. In 20 years of working with large animals, Dr. Chen would later tell reporters from 3 different news stations, "I've never seen anything like what that little girl accomplished. It defied everything I know about animal behavior, bovine psychology, and basic veterinary science." Tom Hendricks climbed out of his truck on unsteady legs, his face pale with shock and something approaching reverence. Miguel Santos stood beside him, both men staring at their prize bull who now stood as docile as a house cat beside the small blind girl. "That bull was ready to destroy half the town," Tom whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I've never seen him that angry, that out of control. And she just walked up to him like she was greeting an old friend." Other witnesses began to emerge from their hiding places. Martha Williams stepped out of the flower shop, her face streaked with tears of relief and amazement. Mrs. Peterson crawled out from behind an overturned table, her quilt display ruined, but her faith in miracles forever restored. Children who had been terrified moments before now pressed against windows and doorways, their young minds more accepting of magic than their parents' logic-bound thinking. 8-year-old Tommy Henderson pointed at Lily in wonder with wide eyes, whispering to his mother, "She's talking to the bull, Mom. She's really talking to him." And in a way, she was. Lily continued to stroke Wonder's massive face with gentle, practiced movements. Her fingers traced the contours of his forehead, scratched behind his ears, and smoothed the coarse hair on his neck. The bull's response was immediate and profound. His entire posture shifted from aggressive to protective, as if he'd appointed himself as Lily's guardian rather than her threat. "What did you say to him, sweetheart?" Rose Morrison asked, as she finally found the courage to approach her granddaughter. Her voice shook with a mixture of relief, pride, and absolute bewilderment. Lily turned toward her grandmother's voice, her sightless eyes bright with a joy that seemed to illuminate her entire face. "I told him he wasn't alone anymore, Grandma. I told him I could hear how scared and confused he was, and that it was okay to be gentle now." The simple explanation hit the gathered crowd like a physical force. In those few words, Lily had revealed something profound about the nature of Wonder's rampage. This hadn't been aggression for its own sake. It had been fear and confusion manifesting as fury. Dr. Chen stepped closer, her medical training overriding her amazement. "Lily, how did you know he was scared? What made you think you could approach him safely?" Lily's head tilted in that characteristic way, as if she were listening to something the rest of them couldn't hear. "He was calling for help," she said simply. "Not with his voice, but with his heart. Sometimes when people or animals are really, really scared, they do scary things to try to make the fear go away. But Wonder wasn't really angry. He was just lost and frightened." Sheriff Davidson found himself kneeling beside Lily, this child who had accomplished what trained professionals couldn't even attempt. "Lily, that was incredibly brave, but also incredibly dangerous. How did you know he wouldn't hurt you?" "Because hurt people," Lily replied with the wisdom that seemed far beyond her 12 years. "But loved people love people, and animals are the same way." Wonder just needed someone to love him instead of being afraid of him. The crowd began to gather closer, drawn by a magnetism they couldn't explain. Wonder showed no signs of agitation at their approach. In fact, he seemed to have appointed himself as Lily's protector, positioning his massive body between her and the growing crowd. Tom Hendricks approached with the reverence of a man witnessing something sacred. "Lily, I've owned Wonder for 5 years. He's always been gentle, but today, something was different. Something set him off. How did you know what to do?" Lily's smile was radiant. "My mom used to tell me that everyone and everything just wants to be understood. She said that when you can't see with your eyes, you learn to see with your heart instead. Wonder's heart was crying, so I listened to it." The mention of her deceased parents cast a brief shadow over the moment, but it also provided a glimpse into the source of Lily's extraordinary gift. Tragedy had taken her sight and her parents, but it had also opened her to connections that others might never experience. Miguel Santos, who had worked with Wonder longer than anyone, shook his head in amazement. "That bull was ready to charge anything that moved. I've seen him gentle, but never like this. It's like she flipped a switch in his brain." "Maybe she did," Dr. Chen mused, her scientific mind trying to process the impossible. "There are documented cases of animals responding to certain individuals in unusual ways. Some people have a natural affinity for communicating with animals through body language, pheromones, or other subtle cues we don't fully understand. But as the crowd watched Lily continue to commune with Wonder, it became clear that what they were witnessing went beyond science, beyond explanation, beyond anything that could be categorized or studied. As word of the miracle in Cedar Ridge spread, something extraordinary began to happen. News crews arrived from 3 states away, but they found a town that had been fundamentally changed by what they'd witnessed. The story wasn't just about a bull and a blind girl. It was about a community that had rediscovered something precious they'd forgotten in the rush of modern life. Dr. Chen conducted a thorough examination of Wonder right there in the town square, with Lily's calming presence keeping the massive bull completely docile. "His vital signs are perfect," she announced to the gathered crowd. "Heart rate normal, breathing regular, no signs of distress or illness. Whatever caused his earlier behavior, it's completely resolved." But Tom Hendricks had been thinking about the timing of Wonder's breakdown, and a terrible realization was dawning on him. "Miguel," he said quietly, "what time did Wonder start acting agitated this morning?" "Before sunrise," Miguel replied. "Maybe 5:30, 6 a.m. Why?" Tom's face went pale. "That's when the Williams family had their accident out on Highway 12. Emergency responders have been going back and forth past the ranch all morning with sirens blaring. Wonder probably thought the ranch was under attack or in danger." The pieces fell into place with stunning clarity. Wonder hadn't been randomly aggressive. He'd been trying to protect his territory and his family from what he perceived as an ongoing threat. The constant sirens, the unusual activity, the stress of not understanding what was happening had built up until the truck backfiring became the final trigger. "He was trying to be a hero," Lily said softly, her hand still resting on Wonder's neck. "He thought his family was in danger, so he tried to go help them, but he got scared and confused when he couldn't find the danger." Sheriff Davidson shook his head in amazement. "So when Lily approached him without fear, without aggression, she gave him permission to stop fighting an enemy that didn't exist." "More than that," Dr. Chen added, watching Lily's interaction with Wonder. "She gave him understanding. Animals, especially highly intelligent ones like bulls, can experience complex emotions including anxiety, confusion, and even what we might call grief. Lily somehow communicated to him that his feelings were valid, but that the threat wasn't real." The crowd watched in continued wonder as Lily guided Wonder around the square, showing him that the place he'd seen as a battlefield was actually a community of friends. The bull's transformation was complete. Where an hour earlier he'd been a force of destruction, he now moved with gentle purpose, careful not to step on debris or come too close to nervous onlookers. Word spread beyond Cedar Ridge like ripples on a pond. By evening, the story had reached national news outlets. "Blind girl stops rampaging bull with whisper" became the headline that captured the world's imagination. But for the people of Cedar Ridge, the real story was more personal and more profound. Mrs. Peterson, whose quilt display had been destroyed, approached Lily with tears in her eyes. "Honey, I've been making quilts for 40 years, but what you did today, that's a masterpiece that can't be sewn with thread. Martha Williams donated a dozen of her prize roses to create a bouquet for Lily, saying, "These flowers are beautiful, but they'll fade. What you showed us today will bloom forever." The teenagers in the high school band, who had initially been terrified by the chaos, now looked at Lily with something approaching awe. They'd learned something about courage that no textbook could teach. As the day wore on, something beautiful began to emerge from the chaos. The community came together to clean up the square, but more importantly, they came together in spirit. Neighbors who had been strangers introduced themselves. People shared stories, offered help, and rediscovered the connections that make a town more than just buildings and streets. Tom Hendricks made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. "Wonder isn't going back to the ranch," he announced. "Not today, anyway. Lily, if your grandmother approves, I'd like Wonder to stay here in town for a while. Maybe we could set up a temporary pen near your house. It seems like you two have formed a bond that shouldn't be broken." Rose Morrison looked at her granddaughter's radiant smile and knew there was only one answer. "I think that would be wonderful, Tom. Our backyard isn't very big, but love doesn't take up much space." The logistics were quickly arranged. The volunteer fire department helped set up a temporary enclosure in the large field behind the Morrison cabin. Wonder seemed perfectly content with the arrangement, settling into his new home like he'd been there all his life. As the sun set over Cedar Ridge, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, Lily sat beside Wonder's enclosure reading him a story from a book written in Braille. Her voice carried clearly in the evening air, telling tales of friendship and understanding while Wonder listened with the attention of a devoted student. Dr. Chen, who had stayed to monitor Wonder's condition, found herself thinking about her veterinary training. "You know," she said to Sheriff Davidson, "they teach us in vet school that animals don't have complex emotions, that they operate purely on instinct. But what I saw today," she shook her head, "maybe we've been looking at this all wrong. Maybe animals feel more than we've given them credit for." 6 months later, Lily and Wonder had become local celebrities, but more importantly, they'd become the heart of a community transformation. The field behind the Morrison cabin had been expanded into a small sanctuary where Lily worked with other animals that needed special care and understanding. Wonder never showed any signs of aggression again. In fact, he became something of a therapy animal, helping other children overcome fears and teaching them about gentleness and connection. His massive size, which had once been intimidating, became a source of comfort for those who learned to see past appearances to the gentle soul beneath. The story of the furious bull and the blind girl spread around the world, inspiring countless others to look beyond fear and see the need for understanding. But for the people of Cedar Ridge, the real miracle wasn't what happened that day. It was what continued to happen every day afterward, as a small blind girl and a misunderstood bull taught an entire community about the power of love, patience, and the courage to reach out to those who are afraid.